Hello everyone, welcome to the jury charge and literary portion of the 200 class. I'm going to start off today from the book of jury instructions, and this is on failure to inform emergency situation. Okay, part 6. Ready? Part 6, Failure to Inform Emergency Situation. A physician or surgeon shall not be liable for damages for injury or death caused in an emergency situation occurring in the physician's or surgeon's office or in a hospital on account of a failure to inform a patient of the possible consequences of a medical procedure where the failure to inform is caused by any of the following. Number 1, the patient was unconscious. Number 2, the medical procedure was undertaken without the consent of the patient because the physician or surgeon reasonably believed that a medical procedure should be undertaken immediately and that there was insufficient time to fully inform the patient. Number 3, a medical procedure was performed on a person legally incapable of giving consent, and the physician or surgeon reasonably believed that a medical procedure should be undertaken immediately, and that there was insufficient time to obtain the informed consent of a person authorized to give such consent for the patient. As used in this instruction, emergency situation occurring in a hospital means a situation occurring in a hospital, whether or not it occurs in an emergency room, requiring immediate services for alleviation of severe pain or immediate diagnosis and treatment of unforeseeable medical conditions, which, if not immediately diagnosed and treated, would lead to serious disability or death. Emergency situation occurring in the physician's or surgeon's office means a situation occurring in an office other than a hospital used by the physician or surgeon for the examination or treatment of patients requiring immediate services for alleviation of severe pain or immediate diagnosis and treatment of unforeseeable medical conditions, which, if not immediately diagnosed and treated, would lead to serious disability or death. Business and Professional Code 2144.5. This section is applicable only to actions for damages for injuries or death arising because of a physician's or surgeon's failure to inform, and not to actions for such damages arising because of a physician's or surgeon's negligence in rendering or failing to render treatment. Okay, I'm going to read from Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, Becoming a Better Listener. Here we go. Ready? I grew up believing I was a good listener, and although I have become a better listener than I was 10 years ago, I have to admit I'm still only an adequate listener. Effective listening is more than simply avoiding the bad habit of interrupting others while they are speaking or finishing their sentences. It's being content to listen to the entire thought of someone rather than waiting impatiently for your chance to respond. In some ways, the way we fail to listen is symbolic of the way we live. We often treat communication as if it were a race. It's almost like our goal is to have no time gaps between the conclusion of the sentence of the person we are speaking with and the beginning of our own. My wife and I were recently at a cafe having lunch, eavesdropping on the conversations around us. It seemed that no one was really listening to one another. Instead, they were taking turns not listening to one another. I asked my wife if I still did the same thing. With a smile on her face, she said, "Only sometimes." Slowing down your responses and becoming a better listener aids you in becoming a more peaceful person. It takes pressure from you. If you think about it, you'll notice that it takes an enormous amount of energy and is very stressful to be sitting at the edge of your seat trying to guess what the person in front of you or on the telephone is going to say so that you can fire back your response. But as you wait for the people you are communicating with to finish, as you simply listen more intently to what is being said, you'll notice that the pressure you feel is off. You'll immediately feel more relaxed, and so will the people you are talking to. They will feel safe in slowing down their own responses because they won't feel in competition with you for airtime. Not only will becoming a better listener make you a more patient person, It will also enhance the quality of your relationships. Everyone loves to talk to someone who truly listens to what they are saying. So true. Okay. Going back to some jury instructions. Okay, here we go. Ready? Members of the jury, the burden is on the plaintiff in a civil action such as this to prove every essential element of his or her claim by a preponderance of the evidence. A preponderance of the evidence means such evidence as, when considered and compared with that opposed to it, has more convincing force and produces in your minds a belief that what is sought to be proved is more likely true than not true. In other words, to establish a claim by a preponderance of the evidence merely means to prove that the claim is more likely so than not so. In determining whether any fact in issue has been proved by a preponderance of the evidence, the jury may consider the testimony of all the witnesses, regardless of who may have called them, and all the exhibits received in evidence, regardless of who may have produced them. If the proof should fail to establish any essential element or plaintiff's claim by a preponderance of the evidence, the jury should find for the defendant as to that claim. Okay, so that was at 190. I'm going to read that again at 200. Okay. All right, here we go. Ready? Members of the jury, the burden is on the plaintiff in a civil action such as this to prove every essential element of his or her claim by a preponderance of the evidence. A preponderance of the evidence means such evidence as, when considered and compared with that opposed to it, has more convincing force and produces in your minds a belief that what is sought to be proved is more likely true than not true. In other words, to establish a claim by a preponderance of the evidence merely means to prove that the claim is more likely so than not so. In determining whether any fact in issue has been proved by a preponderance of the evidence, the jury may consider the testimony of all of the witnesses, regardless of who may have called them, and all the exhibits received in evidence, regardless of who may have produced them. If the proof should fail to establish any essential element of plaintiff's claim by a preponderance of the evidence, the jury should find for the defendant as to that claim. Okay, I'm going to finish up where we left off from Awaken the Giant Within. Okay, we're going to finish up this chapter. In this chapter, we're on enjoy making decisions. Here we go. Ready? You must know that in any moment a decision you make can change the course of your life forever. The very next person you stand behind in line or sit next to on an airplane, the very next phone call you make or receive, the very next movie you see, or book you read or page you turn could be the one single thing that causes the floodgates to open, and all of the things that you've been waiting for fall into place. If you really want life to be passionate, you need to live with this attitude of expectancy. Years ago, I made what seemed like a small decision, and it has powerfully shaped my life. I decided to do a seminar in Denver, Colorado. That decision caused me to meet a lady named Becky. Her name now is Robbins, or her last name is now Robbins, and she is definitely one of the greatest gifts of my life. On that same trip, I decided to write my first book, which is now published in 11 languages around the world. A few days later, I decided to conduct a seminar in Texas, and after working for a week to fill my own program, the promoter didn't pay me for the event. He skipped town. The obvious person to talk to was the public relations agent he had hired, a woman who had similar woes. That woman became my literary agent and helped to get that first book published. As a result, I have the privilege of sharing the story with you today. At one time, I also decided to take on a business partner. Choosing not to investigate his character in advance was a poor decision on my part. Within a year, he'd misappropriated $250,000 and had run my corporation $758,000 in debt while I spent my life on the road doing more than 200 seminars. Fortunately, though, I learned from my poor decision and made a better one. In spite of advice from all the experts around me that the only way I could survive would be to declare bankruptcy, I decided to find a way to turn things around, and I created one of the greater successes of my life. I took my company to a whole new level, and what I learned from that experience not only created my long-term business success, but also provided many of the distinctions for the neuroassociative conditioning and destiny technologies that you will be reading in this book. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. That's from Helen Keller. So what is the single most important distinction to take from this chapter? Know that it's your decisions and not your conditions that determine your destiny. Before we learn the technology for changing how you think and how you feel every day of your life, I want you to remember that in the final analysis, everything you've read in this book is worthless. Every other book you've read or audio you've heard or seminar you've attended is worthless unless you decide to use it. Remember that a truly committed decision is the force that changes your life. It's a power available to you in any moment if you just decide to use it. Prove to yourself that you've decided now. Make one or two decisions that you've been putting off, one easy decision and one that's a bit more difficult. Show yourself what you can do. Right now, stop. Make at least one clear-cut decision that you've been putting off. Take the first action toward fulfilling it and stick to it. By doing this, you'll be building that muscle that will give you the will to change your entire life. You and I both know that there are going to be challenges in your future. But as the people of Eastern Europe have learned, if you've decided to get past the walls, you can climb over them, you can break through them, you can tunnel under them, or you can find a door. No matter how long a wall has stood, none has the power to withstand the continued force of human beings who have decided to persist until it has fallen. The human spirit truly is unconquerable, but the will to win, the will to succeed, to shape one's life, to take control can only be harnessed when you decide what you want and believe that no challenge, no problem, no obstacle can keep you from it. When you decide that your life will ultimately be shaped not by conditions, but by your decisions, then in that moment, your life will change forever and you will be empowered to take control. Okay. We will go back to some jury charge. Here we go. Ready? Members of the jury, the law recognizes that there are some products which, by their very nature, cannot be made completely safe. These include some prescriptive drugs. Products of this nature are said to be unavoidably unsafe. In this case, the parties have stipulated that Prozac falls into this category. If these products are properly prepared and accompanied by proper directions and warning, then they are not defective within the meaning of the law, and liability for injuries caused by these products will not be imposed on their manufacturer. The reason is because the risk of harm is justified by the possible benefits of releasing such products on the market, provided, of course, they are accompanied with proper warnings and instructions. The plaintiffs seek to recover damages based upon a claim of negligence by the supplier of a product. The essential elements of such a claim are: 1. The defendant was the supplier of a product, namely Prozac. 2. The defendant was negligent. And 3. The negligence of that defendant was the cause of injury and damage to the plaintiff. Okay, I'm going to read from a summary of the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And we left off on additional information about Martin Luther King Jr. Early life and education. Ready? Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. His legal name at birth was Michael King. King's father was also born Michael King. The father changed both names on his own during a 1934 trip to Nazi Germany to attend the Fifth Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin. It was during this time he chose to be called Martin Luther King in honor of the great German reformer Martin Luther. Growing up in Atlanta, King attended Booker T. Washington High School. A precocious student, he skipped both the 9th and the 12th grades and entered Morehouse College at age 15 without formally graduating from high school. In 1948, he graduated from Morehouse with a BA degree in sociology and enrolled in Koser Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, from which he graduated with a degree in 1951. King married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Heiberger, Alabama. They became the parents of 4 children: Yolanda King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice King. King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, when he was 25 years old. King then began doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University and received his PhD degree on June 5, 1955, with a dissertation on a comparison of the conceptions of God and thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Ideas, influences, and political stances. Religion. As a Christian minister, Martin Luther King's main influence was Jesus Christ and the Christian Gospels, which he would always quote in his religious meetings, speeches at church, and in public discourses. King's faith was strongly based in Jesus' commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself, loving God above all, and loving your enemies, praying for them, and blessing them. His nonviolent thought was also based in the injunction to turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' teaching of putting the sword back into its place. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King urged action consistent with what he describes as Jesus' extremist love, and also quoted numerous other Christian pacifist authors, which was very usual for him. In his speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," he stated that he just wanted to do God's will. Inspired by Gandhi's success with nonviolent activism, King had for a long time wanted to take a trip to India. With the assistance from the Quaker group, the American Friends Service Committee, he was able to make the trip in April of 1959. The trip to India affected King, deepening his understanding of nonviolent resistance and his commitment to American struggle for civil rights. In a radio address made during his final evening in India, King reflected, "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity." Politics. As a leader of the SCLC, King maintained a policy of not publicly endorsing a U.S. political party or candidate. "I feel someone must remain in the position of non-alignment so that he can look objectively at both parties and be the conscience of both, not the servant or master of either." In his autobiography, King says that in 1960 he privately voted for Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. "I felt that Kennedy would make the best president. I never came out with an endorsement. My father did, but I never made one." King adds that he likely would have made an exception to his non-endorsement policy for a second Kennedy term, saying, "Had President Kennedy lived, I would probably have endorsed him again in 1964. Montgomery bus boycott 1955. In March 1955, a 15-year-old schoolgirl in Montgomery, Claudette Colvin, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man in compliance with Jim Crow laws in the U.S. South that enforce racial segregation. King was on the committee from the Birmingham African American community that looked into the case. Because Colvin was pregnant and unmarried, E.D. Nixon and Clifford Durr decided to wait for a better case to pursue. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat. The Montgomery bus boycott, urged and planned by Nixon and led by King, soon followed. The boycott lasted 385 days, and the situation became so tense that King's house was bombed. King was arrested during this campaign, which concluded with a United States District Court ruling in Browder versus Gale, Browder versus Gale, that ended racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. Okay, that concludes our literary and jury charge for the 200 class. Have a great day.